Well, thank you all so much for coming to this wonderful event. We were just discussing how sad it was that there aren't any salons anymore. And while I don't think we could call this technically a salon, it's sort of salon-like in the intimacy of it. It's very pleasant. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about my book, which is called The Magician King. It doesn't look like this. This is the English edition, which for some reason I picked up as I was leaving. But this is the book. It's been out since August. I'll talk a little bit about it, and then I'll read a little bit from it, and then let's do some question and answer, which is always my favorite part. Although it is incumbent on all of you to think of questions. So everyone think of questions, or we're going to be in terrible trouble once I stop reading. This book came out of my love for young adult fantasy. When I was a child, like just about every child everywhere, I was obsessed with the Chronicles of Narnia, and also a lot of other fantasy, the Tolkien books, T.H. White, and McCaffrey, Fritz Leiber, all of that stuff that you read when you're a kid and you're supposed to grow out of, except I never quite grew out of it. And I've always kept going back to it, and then of course later to Philip Pullman and Harry Potter. And when I was beginning, not this novel, but the predecessor, which is called The Magicians, this is the sequel, I was thinking about what was the most absorbing and compelling reading experience I'd ever had. And if I was being honest with myself, and I was, it had been reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was 8 years old. So I began to think about whether it would be possible. I didn't want to write a young adult fantasy novel. I don't know why I took it. I didn't think I'd be any good at it. But I wondered if it would be possible to tell a story like that. A story about young people who were discovering that they had power that they didn't know they had. Young people finding their way into a secret world that no one else knows about. Would it be possible to tell a story like that? A story like those books that I loved, but to tell it for adults, using all of the sort of adult literary language that we're used to seeing in mainstream fiction, and leaving in all the stuff that young adult fantasy writers generally airbrush out, all the complexities of adult life, and all the sex and booze that you never get to see in Harry Potter, but you're sure it's there. And sort of some of the complicated moral ambiguities that those books sometimes don't deal with. I've always thought that Harry Potter was very lucky to have Voldemort in his life, even though, of course, he was the scourge of his universe and everything like that. I always thought it was very helpful for Harry to have someone in his life who was the incarnation of evil. In some ways, Harry was very clear on what he was going to do when he got up in the morning. He knew what he was going to do, which is that he was going to use his magic to try to defeat Voldemort. But what if you subtract Voldemort from that equation? What if you remove him from the universe? Voldemort had a very organizing effect on Harry's universe. If you take him out of that, suddenly you get a very different kind of world and a different kind of story. It's much less black and white, much more shades of gray. And you get a different kind of story. It's much less about using your magic to fight evil, and much more about trying to figure out, well, if magic was real, what would it be for? What would you do with it? So I'm going to read a short passage from The Magician King. The Magicians and The Magician King have two heroes. One of them is Quentin, who is a young man who is much too clever for his own good. And we're not going to worry about him too much because he's not in this bit. Instead, we're going to worry about Julia. Julia is Quentin's friend. They went to high school together. And Julia was in some ways inspired by a character in the Harry Potter world whose name is Dudley Dursley. Dudley was Harry's cousin, and he's fat and loutish, and you're meant to dislike him, and one does dislike him. But I always felt a little bit sorry for him, because I thought that if I grew up in a house with my cousin who I resented, and then the cousin got to go off to Hogwarts and be a magician, I would be very, very resentful of that. In the books, Dudley is sort of petty about it, he's kind of contemptuous of Harry, but I would sit around and think, my God, magic is real, and it's going on all around me, and I can't do it, I can't be a part of it. What is this thing that's all around me that everybody else knows about, but I'm kind of cut off from? Well, Quentin's friend Julia, in this book, she, like Dudley, is left behind. She gets to take the sort of entrance exam for the big college for magic, but she, for whatever reason, is denied entry. And I'm just going to read you the very beginning of her story, where she takes that exam and then is made to forget it magically. But she doesn't forget it all the way. Something of a residue remains, and it haunts her with this awareness that there's something else out there in the world that she can't quite put her finger on what it is, and it kind of derails her life. She becomes obsessed with it and figuring out what it is. And this scene that I'm going to read takes place, it's the same scene that's at the beginning of The Magicians, the first book, but it's told from Julia's point of view. And so we get to sort of see what she was up to while Quentin was off having his adventures in The Magicians. You have to go back to the beginning, to that freezing, miserable afternoon in Brooklyn when Quentin took the Break-Bills exam, to understand what happened to Julia, because Julia took the Break-Bills exam that day too. And after she took it, she lost 3 years of her life. Her story started the same day that Quentin's did, but it was a very different kind of story. On that day, the day that Quentin and James and Julia walked along Fifth Avenue together on the way to the boys' Princeton interview, Quentin's life had split wide open. Julia's life hadn't, but it did develop a crack. It was a hairline crack at first, nothing much to look at. It was cracked, but you could still use it. It was still good. No point in throwing her life away. It was a perfectly fine life. Or, no, it wasn't fine, but it worked for a while. She'd said goodbye to James and Quentin in front of that brick house. They'd gone in, she walked away, it started to rain. She went to the library. This much she was pretty sure was true. This much had probably actually happened. But then, something happened that didn't happen. She'd sat in the library with her laptop and a stack of books and written her paper for Mr. Karras. It was a damn good paper. It was about an experimental utopian socialist community in New York State in the 19th century. The community had some praiseworthy ideals, but also some creepy sexual practices, and eventually it lost its mojo and morphed into a successful silverware company instead. She had some ideas about why the whole arrangement worked better as a silverware company than it had as an attempt to realize Christ's kingdom on earth. She was pretty sure she was right. She'd gone into the numbers, and in her experience, when you went into the numbers, you usually came out with pretty good answers. James met her at the library. He told her what had happened with the interview, which was weird enough as it was, what with the interviewer turning up dead and all. Then she went home. She had dinner. She went up to her room. She wrote the rest of the paper, which took until 4 in the morning. She grabbed 3 hours of sleep. She got up, blew off the first 2 classes while she fixed her endnotes, and went to school in time for social studies. Mischief managed. When she looked back, the whole thing had a queer, unreal feeling to it. But then again, you often get a queer, unreal feeling. When you stay up till 4, you get up at 7. Things didn't start to fall apart until a week later when she got her paper back. The problem wasn't the grade, it was a good grade. It was an A-. Mr. K did not give out a lot of those. The problem was, what was the problem? She read the paper again, and though it read all right, she didn't recognize everything in it, but she'd been writing fast. And, well, the thing she snagged on was the same thing that Mr. K snagged on. She'd gotten a date wrong. See, the utopian community that she was writing about had run afoul of a change in federal statutory rape laws that took place in 1878, and she knew that. Whereas the paper said 1881, which Mr. K would never have caught, although, come to think of it, he was a pretty creepy character himself, and she wouldn't be surprised if he knew his way around a statutory rape law or two. Except that Wikipedia made the same mistake, and Mr. K loved to do spot checking to catch people relying on Wikipedia. He checked the date, and he checked Wikipedia, and he put a big red X in the margin of Julia's paper, and a minus after her A. He was surprised at her. He really was. Julia was surprised too, because she never used Wikipedia, partly because she knew that Mr. K checked, but mostly because, unlike a lot of her fellow students, she cared about getting her facts right. She went back through the paper and checked it thoroughly. She found a second mistake, and a third, no more, but that was enough. She started checking versions of the paper, because she always saved and backed up separate drafts as she went, because track changes in Word is bullshit. And she wanted to know at what point exactly the errors got in. But the really weird thing was, there were no earlier versions. There was only the final draft. This fact, although it was a minor fact with multiple plausible explanations, proved to be the big red button that activated the ejector seat that blew Julia out of the cozy cockpit of her life. She sat on her bed and she stared at the file, and she felt fear, because the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like she had two sets of memories for that afternoon, not just one. One of them was almost too plausible. It had the feel of a scene from a novel written by an earnest realist who was more concerned with presenting an amalgamation of naturalistic details that fit together plausibly than with telling a story that wouldn't bore the hell out of the reader. It felt like a cover story. That was the one where she went to the library. She met James and had dinner and wrote the paper. But the other one was just batshit insane. And the other one, she'd gone to the library and done a simple search on one of the cheapo library workstations on the blonde wood tables by the circulation desk. The search had yielded a call number, and the call number was odd. It put the book in the sub-basement stacks. Well, Julia was pretty sure the library didn't have any sub-basement stacks, because it did not have a sub-basement. As if in a dream, she walked to the brushed steel elevator, and sure enough, beneath the round white plastic button marked B, there was now also a round plastic button marked SB. She pressed it, and it glowed. The dropping sensation in her stomach was just an ordinary dropping sensation, the kind you get when you're descending rapidly toward a sub-basement, full of cheap metal shelving, and the buzz of fluorescent lights and exposed pipes with red-painted daisy wheel valve handles poking out at them at odd angles. But that's not what she saw when the elevator doors opened. Instead, she saw a sun-soaked stone terrace in back of a country house with green gardens all around. It wasn't actually a house, the people there explained. It was a school. It was called Breakbills, and the people who lived there were magicians. They thought she might like to be one too. All she would have to do was pass one simple test. Just going to continue on a couple pages more, assuming we're on track for time. A funny thing happened to Julia after that business with her fake social studies paper. It was a magic trick, you might even call it. Where once there had been only one Julia, there were now two Julias, one for each set of memories. The Julia that went with the first set, the normal set, the one where she wrote the paper and went home and had dinner, did normal Julia things. She went to school, she did her homework, she played the oboe, she finally slept with James, which she'd kind of been meaning to do anyway, but for some reason had been putting off. But there was a second, stranger Julia, growing inside that first Julia like a parasite, or a horrible tumor. At first it was tiny, the size of a bacterium, a single cell of doubt, but it divided and divided and grew and grew. This second Julia was not interested in school, or the oboe, or even James particularly. The problem was that Julia was smart, and Julia was interested in the truth. She didn't like inconsistencies, and she didn't let go until they were resolved, ever, when she was 5. She'd wanted to know why Goofy could talk and Pluto couldn't. How could one dog have another dog for a pet? And one be sentient, and the other not? Likewise, she wanted to know who the lazy bastard was who wrote her paper on intentional communities for her and used Wikipedia as a source, granted that the answer, the nefarious agents of a secret school for wizards in upstate New York, was not a leadingly plausible answer to her question, but it was the answer that fit her memories. And those memories were getting sharper all the time, and as they got sharper, the second Julia grew stronger and stronger, and every bit of strength she gained, she took away from that first Julia, who got weaker and weaker, and thinner, to the point where she was practically transparent, and the parasite behind the mask of her face became almost visible. Funny thing was that nobody noticed. Nobody noticed that she had less and less to say to James, or that 3 weeks to go before the holiday concert, she lost first chair in the oboe section of the very competitive Manhattan Conservatory Extension School Youth Orchestra, thereby forfeiting the juicy solo in Peter and the Wolf, the Duck's theme, to the demonstrably inferior Evelyn O., whose rendition of it did appropriately enough sound like a quacking fucking duck. Well, that was December. By March, she and James were hanging by a thread. She'd dyed her hair black and painted her nails black in order to more accurately resemble the second Julia. James initially found this sexy and goth, and he stepped up his efforts in the sex department, which wasn't actually a welcome side effect, but it made a break from talking to him, which was getting harder and harder. They'd never been as good a couple as they looked. He wasn't a real bona fide nerd, just nerd-friendly, nerd-compatible. And you could only explain your Gödel, Escher, Bach references so many times before it starts to be a problem. Pretty soon he was going to figure out that she wasn't role-playing a sexy, depressed goth chick. She had actually become a sexy, depressed goth chick. And she was enjoying it. She was dipping a toe in the pool of bad behavior and finding that the temperature was just right. It was fun being a problem. Julia had been very, very good for a very long time. And the funny thing about that was, if you're too good too much of the time, people start to forget about you. You're not a problem. So people can strike you off their list of things to worry about. Nobody makes a fuss over you. They make a fuss over the bad girls. In her quiet way, second Julia was causing a bit of a fuss for once in her life, and it felt good. Then Quentin came to visit. She'd always liked Quentin. Basically, he was sarcastic and spookily smart, and on some level, basically a kind person who just needed a ton of therapy and maybe some mood-altering drugs. Something to selectively inhibit the voracious reuptake of serotonin that was obviously going on inside his skull 24/7. She felt bad about the fact that he was in love with her and that she found him deeply unsexy, but not that bad. Honestly, he was decent looking, better looking than he thought he was, but that moody boy band Narnia shit cut like zero ice with her. And she was smart enough to know whose problem that was, and it was not hers. But when he came back in March, there was something different about him, something otherworldly and glittery-eyed. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. He had seen things. There was a smell coming off his fingers, the smell you got after they ran the really big Van de Graaff generator at the Science Museum. This was a man who had handled lightning. They all went down to the boat launch on the Gowanus Canal, and she smoked cigarette after cigarette, and she just looked at him, and she knew. He had gone through to the other side, and she had been left behind. She thought she'd seen him there. The exam at Breakbills, in the hall with the chalk clock, with the glasses of water and the disappearing children, and now she knew she was right. But it had been very different for him, she realized. When he walked into that room, he had buckled right down, and he had killed that exam. Because magic school? Well, that was just the kind of thing he had been waiting to happen to him his whole life. He practically expected that shit. He'd been wondering when it was going to show up, and when it did, he was good and ready for it. Whereas Julia had been blindsided. She had never expected anything special to just happen to her. Her plan for life was to get out there and make special things happen. She could have handled the math, God knew. She'd been in math classes with Quentin since they were 10 years old, and anything he could do, she could do just as well, backward and in high heels if necessary. But she'd spent too much time looking around, trying to work it through, the implications of it. She didn't take it at face value the way Quentin did. The test was the last of her priorities. It was the least interesting thing in the room, which she still stood by as the reasonable, intelligent person's reaction to the situation. But now, Quentin was on the inside, and she was out here, chain-smoking on the Gowanus boat dock with her half-orc boyfriend. Quentin had passed the test, and she had failed. It seemed that reason and intelligence weren't getting it done anymore. They were cutting like zero ice. It was when Quentin left that day that Julia really fell off the cliff. Thank you.
So maybe anybody who wants to or has a question would like to have a question. Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So like two related questions. One that I just find interesting to ask a writer like yourself is, I'm just curious, how would you just simply define what is a word, and how is a word from your experience different from an image? What can an image do that a word, what's the relationship between the two? And I'm just curious about your process when you go into this magical world, and a lot of people say that they sort of like allow, they surrender, and it's as if a voice is speaking through you. So, if you could just speak to whatever you choose to speak.
Yeah, well, I thought a lot about that, especially that first question about words and images. Because it's sort of a cliche to say that we've become a visual culture. And I remember this famous moment, Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs, who ran Apple, someone saying, "Are you going to make an ebook, like a Kindle?" And he said, "Why? Nobody reads anymore." And so, it made me think a lot about what we as writers and readers are up against. Novels have there's a lot livelier competition for people's entertainment time and dollars than there were in, for example, the 18th century when the novel first appeared in its modern form. And I thought a lot about, why am I doing this? Should I go to Hollywood and be a TV writer? I would be very bad at that, one. But also, that the more I begin to think about it, if you think about what an image is, what a word is, if you think about an image file on a computer, even just a JPEG, it's compared to a Word text file. It's a very large file. Video is huge. Images and music are medium-sized. Text files are very small. There's very little information in a word, just from an information science point of view. There's very few bits in it, which means that you, as the reader, are called upon to do a lot of work. You have to supply a lot of what's going on. You bring the information yourself. You decide what everything looks like and what it sounds like. You dress the set. You do the line readings. It's a lot of work. The reader is doing almost as much work as the writer in a book. And that really, it's good for you. It involves you in a book. You're the collaborator of the book. You're the co-author. And doing that work involves you in the story that's just textual in ways that I don't think movies and TV do. It's different. Not that I don't love movies and TV. Not that I'm not energetically trying to turn that into a television show as we speak. But it'll never be the same as the book. And I'm a big advocate of the word, the written word, and its importance as something that we need to curate going into the new millennium, which I guess we're already in. I think if we become a visual culture, we'll be a poorer culture.
Any other questions from you? Yeah.
So there's this whole secondary, it seems in your book you're planning to say there are two worlds, right? So you have kind of the magical world that, to some point, I'm assuming because I haven't read it, but there's kind of a suspension of belief or a faith or something like, the other person you talked about being influenced by the world behind it, at the end of the wardrobe that the children can go into, and it becomes more perhaps visual and symbolic than the world outside of it. So the big lion is Christ. And, there's all these images in it.
Yeah.
Is there a way that maybe kind of you're playing with some of these issues with the sort of cynical, rational outside world where you see some tricks, it's magic, and this inside world is somehow more coherent and visual, or are you kind of pushing against that?
I would say in a lot of ways I'm pushing against it. As I said before, I was very obsessed with the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a kid. That was a really formative experience for me, reading about this story about a bunch of kids during the Blitz in England, which my mother lived through and tells stories about, finding their way into this world that, yes, was more meaningful. It meant more. It was more coherent, more organized. It was this place where they were heroes and they lived out this wonderful story. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how poorly that idea had prepared me for later life. And there's a level on which I think for years and years I thought, on some level I believed that I was going to stumble on a doorway to some other better world, which caused me to really lose a lot of interest in this world that we're in. So I wanted to push back in some ways against Lewis and write against him. Philip Pullman talks about that a lot, about how his work is a critique of Lewis's. And I think about my work that same way. I love Lewis, but I wanted to play with that idea. And so, when the characters in The Magicians and The Magician King, they go to this other world, and they, funnily enough, they are fantasy readers as well. So they've read Narnia, they've read Harry Potter. They have a whole idea about what to expect. I thought this was a funny thing about the Harry Potter books, that Harry Potter never seemed to have read a fantasy novel. So he was just blown away when he got to Hogwarts. He had no idea, it's just amazing. Whereas I think that if I had grown up in this, locked in a closet, all I would have done was to read these stories. So I had my hero, and all the characters in here know about Harry Potter, and have some ideas about what this other world was going to be like. And then I had the pleasure of slowly demolishing those ideas, and this world that they believe is going to be meaningful and symbolic, and they'll be able to engage in this struggle between right and wrong, becomes more and more complicated and less clear, until it comes finally to resemble our world a lot more than they would really like.
Any other questions from you?
Go ahead.
Please. No?
I mean, I can add also, I work, by day I'm the book critic at Time Magazine, so I'm happy to talk about that as well, if anybody's curious about it. I'm trying to do my reading. Oh, do you?
Yeah, for a long time. I thought that's where you were.
Yeah, that's me. It's fine. Some people sometimes are confused. Are there two Lev Grossmans? Which would be odd because it's an unusual name, but in fact there's only one, using two different voices.
Neither of you are magical.
No, either one. Maybe there's a third magical one somewhere.
I think it's really exciting what you said about the collaboration between the reader and the writer, and that in your books you really want the reader to work, because we make theater with that. That's how we make theater. We don't make conventional theater just for entertainment, and that's an issue.
Yeah.
It's a question. So, do you read a book for entertainment? If it's too hard, do you want to read it? If you go to the theater and you're uncomfortable, what do you do? Is that okay? Those are all questions that come up if you look at it in a non-judgmental way, but just the issue itself. And I agree with you. I think that's the journey.
Yeah.
That
You have to ask yourself, how much can you ask of your audience? What will they bring to this experience? And in some ways, my books are not interpretively difficult in the way that the way a book like Ulysses is, or The Sound and the Fury. I feel like there are concessions you have to make. This book, in some ways, asks a lot less even than books like, who's a difficult writer who's writing now? there's fewer and fewer of them. I don't know, like Jhumpa Lahiri, wonderful writer who I admire a lot. But you know, her novels, they're not as plot driven. Her work is not as plot driven. It's not as interpretively clear. It asks a lot of work from you. Probably my works are more accessible than that. And I think just mindful that I'm competing against video games, which frankly are a lot of fun. You know, you need to. I feel like I have to think realistically about what people need novels to do for them. And that is, in some part, to entertain them. Yeah.
You mean that you're competing against video games? Are you for an audience or for how you write or what?
For an audience, for their money and for their time, people have a finite amount of time they can spend being entertained, and they slice it up, and they make decisions about it, and they don't care about me or sending my kids to college. You know, they just got home from work and they're tired. And I think about, you know, when they're in that position, what are they going to reach for? And I love video games. I play them myself. Sometimes you just don't want a book, but sometimes you do. So you want to be the book that someone wants when they want a book, and it's a challenge. Yeah.
I was just wondering about your organizational process, about how you organize and get the story straight in your head. And like some people say, you start with the end, you go back to the beginning, or you chart it out, or you put index cards on. How do you conceive of your story and keep yourself going until you get from the beginning to the end?
It's difficult. It's difficult. I start knowing the beginning and knowing the ending, and being extremely unsure about all the stuff that becomes in between, which I think is common for writers. Someone once said, and I quote it all the time, I should find out who said it, that writing a novel is a lot like driving cross country at night. You know where you are, you know you're going to end up on the other coast, but you can only see about 50 yards ahead of you in the headlights. So I write outlines before I start. I'm too chicken to just go in and start improvising. I need some kind of a roadmap. And inevitably, the outline falls apart into little pieces, and then you pick them up and rearrange them some other way. It's usually better than the way you started. But I always start with a little outline, like an outline with like Roman numeral, big letter A, number that just shows all the scenes and what's going to happen in them. And then at a certain point, I throw it away. But I need it, just to start out with. It's hard because it's hard to stay organized when you're writing something like this, 140,000 words. It's not even especially long by novel standards, but it takes about 2 years to write. You can lose your way very, very easily. It's a real challenge.
Do you write every day
No.
on a novel like this?
No, I can't. I mean,
No.
I have a job and 2 small children. It just doesn't work that way. And for a long time, I felt as though there was something wrong with me as a writer, that I did not write every day. Someone, probably Hemingway, that bastard, probably he was the guy who said that you had to write every day.
Tennessee Williams.
Was it?
Oh, yeah.
It's hogwash. Writing. I'm a binger. I need 5-6 hours. It takes me a while to get revved up. And then once I'm revved, I stay revved for a few hours. I don't noodle with something for half an hour a day. It's just, I can't do it. It's not for me.
Oh,
Hello.
so we have
More guests?
Women here from the New York Times,
Yeah,
if you
okay.
don't mind.
Come on in.
hi.
This way.
Oh, no, it's okay, thanks, it's about the whole scene.
Oh, okay. All right.
We have about 2 minutes till we have to go to the next.
We go to the next.
But you can stay for as long as you want.
Thank you.
Well, if it's 2 minutes, I'll just thank you all for coming so much. I truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's very fascinating to hear you talk about your novel, but also to read from it. It's really fascinating. I never read anything. I didn't know about you before I heard about you, and you became our guest. But I'm definitely going to read your books. It's really very interesting and fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
That's great.
Great.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Do you have any?